Okay, hello, I'm Evelyn and I'm joining today from Leipzig, Germany from my balcony as I'm taking part in this meeting in the virtual way because I decided not to fly or travel all the way to Glasgow. Coming up with some different perspective on the topic, how we can actually tackle the climate crisis. My talk will focus more on how can we integrate sustainability topics into our research, to a practical way in our research. And my topic will be, does the way to a sustainable mind go through the gut to the brain? And why did I choose the topic? I want to give you some background on why this is such an important topic overall, but also for my personal interest. If we consider the environmental impact of global food production, you can see here that our food and agriculture sectors on a global scale contribute to about a fourth of global greenhouse gas emissions, 50% of land use, 70% of fresh water use, 80% of eutrophication potential, and over 90% of biodiversity loss. So the numbers and the impact is quite shocking overall, but this also means that there's quite a huge potential to reduce those numbers if we change something. Because if we go to a more individual scale here, we can see that the environmental impact for different diet types can also be quite different. So this is a simplified data graph from Alexandrovich, and we can see here in the bottom line that replacing beef and lamb with other meat already saves up to about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions related to your diet. If you further reduce animal-based content in the diet, for example, in a vegan diet, there's about the reduction potential of 50% of greenhouse gas emissions related to individual diet. And these numbers are quite similar for land use and water use as well. So there's quite a potential to drop these numbers that we've seen on the slide before. And a different publication here from Clark et al. PNAS shows similar numbers. Here we see that in green, the plant-based ingredients compared to the colored ones, which are animal-based and sweetened, sugared beverages and olive oil, that the green food items, plant-based items, have a lower relative environmental impact compared to the others. But what is important here is they also assess the relative risk of disease. And that as well, the pattern kind of looks a bit similar, that the relative risk for disease is lower for the greener items. And if we put the two into perspective, we can actually see quite a nice association showing that a higher relative risk of mortality also goes along with a higher relative environmental impact. And this, for example, here in red, you can see that this is quite high for meat, whereas for all the other green items, the plant-based ones, the relative risk is quite low and accompanied by rather relative environmental impact as well, clustering all in the lower left quadrant. Okay, so the take-home message here is that sustainable diets have co-benefits, and those can help to counter the twofold problem of the climate crisis and malnutrition. Okay, so why don't we then just all switch to vegan diets? Why is behavioral change so hard to achieve? This was a question I was asking myself before I started my PhD. And then in the process, you may know that in Europe, for example, there are about 3% of people following a vegan diet, yet this is growing in number. However, it's still quite a niche in the population. So I was asking, how do these people get to the sustainable mind? So why do they change their diet? And how do they maybe also feed it in the long run? How can they sustain their dietary choices in that way? So coming from this kind of a prompt idea before my PhD, I had then the task to put that into a testable research question. So I kind of had to go from this very broad question and filtrate it down, distill it down to a very essential question of interest that one could put into a clinical trial. So basically about a year or so, I was preparing to design my own study. And I came across questions such as, would I look at dietary patterns versus single ingredients? Would I look at dietary change versus supplements? How would the people be informed already about dietary choice making? Would they rather be informed eaters versus naive eaters? Would I be interested in any metabolic subgroups of predispositions in that context? So would I look at normal weight versus overweight? Since we're in the neuroscience context of food decision making, which neural correlate would I actually want to measure? And how would I measure it? Would I need a self-made fMRI task, or was there already an established task I could use? Would I be interested in high-level versus low-level fMRI contrasts? And then also, since we were targeting dietary intervention and looking at brain, I was of course also interested which mechanistic route would be then interesting to measure, and how to blind the study on both sides was a big question, and so on and so on. So there were many questions that from this quite of prompted everyday life question that I had to inspire my research had to be boiled down to a certain specific point. And this was a super inspiring and helpful process of about a year, as I said. So I can just encourage you to do it, just with a little bit of a hint that this may take longer, as when you're just following up on an already quite precise field of research that has been quite established. Okay. So what did we do and what did we find? So in our registered and pre-registered study, we came up with the following design. So it's a human dietary intervention study in a crossover within subject design. Participants were following 14 days of intervention, either fiber or placebo, interleaved with a washout period of 14 days. Before and after each condition, there was a full testing day, and this full testing day included biomarker sampling, a very long MRI session, and other measurements. And in this very long fMRI session, there was one fMRI task included where people were looking at stimuli. And those stimuli were food and art images. And we were actually in particular interested in the food wanting aspect. So participants saw the picture and they had to rate them on a scale from 1 to 8, how much they want this right now. For the art prints, it was the same, how much you want this right now, and they would then receive the food reward and the art picture and print after scanning. So we particularly decided to go for a high level contrast, contrasting primary reward of food versus secondary reward of art images that we created ourselves to kind of be able to depict this aesthetic pleasure. Okay, what did we find? In our pre-registered analysis, we could firstly see that our intervention worked well. So we were targeting the gut microbiome with the fiber intervention, showing that certain bacterial genera increased after 2 weeks already. So that was quite a massive effect. For our wanting ratings, we saw that food images were higher rated in wanting as art images, which was expected. And if we were looking at this behavioral data on the intervention effect, there was actually no interaction effect for food and art pictures. Yet, when we were looking at a higher resolution on specific food and art categories, we could find that after fiber intervention, the caloric quartiles 2 and 3 were higher rated and wanted than the 2 other caloric quartiles. What would be the correlate on a neural level? We were also, of course, very excited to see that data. And in this parametric modulation of wanting by caloric content in a linear way, 3 significant clusters emerged in the reward network. And those specifically were in the VTA and in the OFC. And in all 3 clusters, the activity diminished for higher wanted, higher caloric images. If you're interested in more details on the project, please come find my poster 2177. I can tell you all about it. Okay. Next to this super huge MRI study, of course, food decision making we know is mostly also, of course, influenced by other factors, external factors, and also maybe single meal choices would already be quite telling for us. So in a different project here in the Mensa study, we were looking at single meal choice and psychological factors in smartphone embedded studies in all of Germany and Austria, in university cafeterias, and we could actually track people with photos, and also we gave them emoji scales to rate their mood and hunger always before and after a meal. And this was quite an extensive study, and we were looking at different aspects of food decision making here as well, and you can find more details on that in the preprint. All data is also open. So the take-home message here is sustainable diets might be able to alter how we make food decisions at the moment of choice, but also maybe in future decision-making processes. So that's all great. I showed you one example of how one can come from an everyday life question into research projects on the topic of sustainability and sustainable food decision making. Yet, of course, there's also the other side of the coin, which is sustainable science itself. So how do we actually perform the science that we're doing? And to give you some ideas, and we were thinking about this quite a lot with my colleagues Simon and Gisela from our institute. And we published that in an opinion paper where we are arguing that there is a sustainability argument for open science implementation, and what exactly all of the different aspects of science and scientific activities you can find in detail in the paper. But overall, what we say is that open science is a super great tool to also reduce our environmental impact of research activities. So what can you do now in your research? So you can see this whole palette of open science practices. And I think the best part actually is that before a project, you really go and check practice by practice, which one you can implement in your project. And then you can also carefully plan to implement those, have the right consent forms and everything well planned ahead. If you're already on project, I think you can still check and go through the different practices and see which ones you can still apply. For example, publishing strategy and others. Post-project, maybe your study is already out and published and you're looking back at your data from 4 or 5 years ago or so. I think you can still check which open science practices you can implement. Is there any way of opening up some data or materials or code you used at the time? And just to give you an idea of also how that happened to me in my project. So I showed you quite the streamlined pre-registered type of analysis that we did beforehand. Yet, since this was quite a large project, we are also required to have quite some methodological advancements going on. And most of them, they were side projects, and none of these were pre-registered, as I said, but still most of them could be published open access, and open material and open code could be provided in one or the other cases, always depending on the project itself. But I just want to highlight also that there is quite a potential maybe also hidden in side projects. And all of this is nice and great, but of course our most important factors as neuroscientists is our way of traveling, but also in terms of methods, the most impactful method, of course, is neuroimaging. And since we cannot stop scanning, of course, I decided to estimate the CO2 emissions from different projects that I was running or taking part in. And just to give you an idea, like an average project of a certain size here, maybe normal size for neuroscience was about 3 tons of CO2. Yeah, which is quite an amount of emissions. And since I couldn't really do anything about that, of course, I then decided to go for CO2 compensation in these 3 projects. So the take-home message here is that open science helps to do sustainable science. And just to finish up, I just wanted to give you again the 2 sides of the coin. So I really want to encourage you to reflect upon science and sustainability topics that interest you and that you can actually move from everyday life into a research context. And then also, of course, the sustainable side of the science. So how do we do science? How do we travel? But also just really practically, which methods do we use and how do we publish, etc. And with this, I'm at the end of my talk. I'm really happy for all of my colleagues and collaborators and all the initiatives I am taking part in, and I'm happy to receive your questions via chat. Thank you.